All right. We are going to get started. And I'm so excited, as I said before, to be in today's session and to be with all of you. And as many of you know, today's briefing is called Show Me the Money, the most important title, really, the appropriations process. And I am so pleased to join you here at the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center. My name is Emma Mirabi. I'm the new Chief of Staff here at the CPCC. And as I said before, I'm just really looking forward to today's webinar. And I want to thank all of you. The reason that we do this is for you, it's for our audience members, it's for our stakeholders, it's for our movement leaders, and for our partners. And so we're excited to learn, and I hope you're ready to learn. And as I said before, I'll say for the third time, please introduce yourself in the chat as you come in. And like I said, there's a poll that pops up on your screen, and we want to learn what you want to learn. We want to know how you want to engage and what you hope to take away from this briefing today. And before we start, I really do have some brief housekeeping notes, and I'll keep them short because I know the reason that you came is not to hear from me. So first, the CPCC, for many of you who have joined these briefings before, is a 501c3 organization. Therefore, we really aren't going to dive into deep policy. We're going to dive into deep policy discussions, but we're not going to engage in electoral or partisan conversations during this session. Second, we've enabled closed captioning. And so if you go to the bottom of your screen, click on live transcripts, you can enable the closed captioning portion. As many of you know, with AI, it's often imperfect. So we'll be adding improved captions before we send a video of this event to you later this week. And lastly, again, for many of you who have joined these sessions before, we really want you to take away something. We want you to learn, and we want you to feel empowered. And so we want you to ask questions of our incredible panel. They're only as good as audience engagement. And so if you want to ask a question, you can drop your questions into the chat or in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of this panel, we'll get to as many questions as we can. And in some instances, we'll actually be able to just write them out in the Q&A box. And so I'm so excited, I can't say it enough apparently, to dive into today's discussion on the appropriations process. And in other words, for those who are wonky like myself, it's really how Congress uses its power of the purse. And from my own experience, I know that this process is very complex and often not transparent, but it is so critical, and it's an underused tool for our movement leaders, for our grassroots organizations, and for community members who just care about what is funded in their communities. But as we all know, some of our elected officials vote on billions of dollars in funding every year for everything from Head Start and healthcare to the bloated Pentagon budget. But what we invest in matters, because budgets are moral documents. They show what we care about and our values as a nation. And the decisions that members make every year shape the programs that our communities rely on. So we need to use every tool we can. We need to keep raising our voices, and we need to use the tactics that staffers inside Congress use to get things done. And what you can do as advocates to help. So we're about to close the poll since I'm done with my introductory remarks. So if you haven't already, please fill out the poll. And we're going to share our results in a moment before we introduce the panelists. Amazing. How much do you know about the appropriations process already? 46%. This is my first time learning. 48%. I understand mostly about the appropriations process, but I want to learn more. Great. We want to learn more details and tips. 6%. I know inside and out. I want to focus on the current moment. Second question. What do you want to focus on today? 42% said the process and timeline. 36% said strategies for advocates. 22% said, what's different this year? Do you want to plan and do you want to plan to be engaged in the appropriations process this year? Yes, I'm excited, 53%. 19% said I'll consider it. And then maybe no. These are great answers. Thank you all so much. Now, as we turn to our gallery views, you all can see about to see our fantastic panelists. I'm going to introduce them today to break down why the appropriations process matters so much and how you can be engaged. So our first panelist is Asik, who is a research analyst for the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, working on analysis of the federal budget and military spending. He's particularly interested in examining how militarized U.S. domestic and foreign policy interacts with efforts to address long-term societal threats like accelerating inequality and climate change. Letty is a partner with Actum LLC, a global consulting firm where she focuses on helping nonprofits advance family justice issues, including paid leave and childcare. Prior to joining Actum, she was the Senior Managing Director of Government Affairs at Clark Hill. As many of you know, Letty is a veteran of Capitol Hill with more than 2 decades in public service. She has dedicated her career to the working families agenda, working on gender equality issues, labor law for elected officials such as the Appropriations Committee ranking member, then chair, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, and former Senate Help Chair, Senator Patty Murray. Erika is the Communications Director for the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights. Before that, in her many capacities, she served as the Chief Advocacy Officer for Raices and is the former press secretary for the Latino Outreach for the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign. She started her community organizing experience when she co-founded the Arizona Dream Act Coalition. Her personal struggle as an immigrant herself has given her the drive and the passion to keep fighting for immigrant and human rights. Sarah Wiggins is a work-from-home mom of 2 amazing tiny humans. Shout out to all the parents out there, myself included, and a grassroots advocate. She joins us today as part of her work with Parents Together Action, an organization dedicated to building a world where every child has the support and opportunities we all want for our own kids. Now, finally, before we get into our fantastic panel today and discussion, I'm going to turn it over to my fantastic colleague, Ross Brennan, who is a Senior Legislative Affairs Associate here at the Center. He's going to give us a quick overview of the appropriations process to kick off our discussion. Ross joined the CPCC team after serving on Capitol Hill for 7 years in David Cicilline's office. Ross, all you.
Great. Thanks so much, Emma, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today's briefing. For those of you I haven't met, as Emma mentioned, I'm Ross Brennan, Senior Legislative Affairs Associate at the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, he, him, and I'm going to speak about appropriations and key inflection points to keep in mind as we move through this year's process. So while much of the timeline for the annual appropriations process is set by law, the federal government often doesn't abide by these deadlines, which can make it hard for the public to know when to engage Congress should they want to advocate for particular priorities in their community. So to help explain these important dates, the CPCC put together a rough timeline of key moments during the annual appropriations process, which is on your screen and which I will go through now. So the first step of the appropriations process is setting a budget. So to kick this off, the president first submits a budget to Congress. And by law, the president has to submit a budget for the upcoming fiscal year to Congress by the first Monday in February. However, administrations often miss these deadlines. So for example, the Biden administration intends to submit its 2024 fiscal year budget to Congress next month on March 9th. And the president's budget indicates the administration's spending priorities for the upcoming fiscal year. So, for example, the president's 2023 fiscal year budget proposed a 29% boost to the Environmental Protection Agency's budget, which would bring the agency's funding to an all-time high. And while many may appreciate this increase, myself included, unfortunately, the president's budget does not become law. So Congress is free to adopt or ignore the spending levels the administration recommends. So think of it more as like a list of suggestions for spending levels than a binding document that Congress has to adhere to. And then next, Congress considers and passes a budget resolution generally between April and June, which you can see in that next panel there. And this Congress-passed budget resolution is not signed by the president and does not become law. However, most importantly, it does include the total federal funding for the appropriations committees to distribute among different government agencies and programs for the fiscal year. So it's like determining the size of the whole pie before determining the size of the slices, if that makes sense. So this brings us to step 2, writing the appropriations bills. So between March and late April, the Appropriations Committee solicits funding requests from members of Congress. And this is really important because it shows the Appropriations Committee, who actually write the spending bills, how important a given program or agency is to its members. So that's a really crucial step in the process. And so during this time, members circulate letters to appropriators for other members to sign that indicate shared support or opposition to a certain federal program. So like an example, in 2022, members sent an appropriations letter requesting at least $49 billion for the National Institutes of Health for FY23. And members often sign these letters in response to requests from constituents and advocates. So they're really eager to hear from you. Advocates may also ask members to support specific federal projects or earmarks, as they're called, but they're now called congressional directed spending or community project funding. And these are items in appropriations bills for specific local projects in a given member's district. So for example, a member's district may receive funding to expand clean water infrastructure through an earmark, and they're usually sort of smaller physical projects. So next, the House Appropriations Committee's 12 subcommittees begin hearings on federal programs. They release their spending bills to the public, and then they mark up or amend the bills to prepare them for the House floor. Members on the Appropriations Committee can offer amendments to alter the spending levels in the bills or put conditions on the funding before it goes to the full House for a vote. And then also during this time, the Senate Appropriations Committee considers its 12 appropriations bills. The Senate only often considers some of the 12 bills on the Senate floor and instead uses the House-passed appropriations bills as the true starting point for negotiations between the two chambers. And in recent years, the House has introduced and initiated appropriations bills consideration, though the Senate can introduce and pass their own versions if they'd like to. So if all of this goes according to plan, and it rarely does, the House Appropriations Committee finalizes their bills between June and July. Again, it's rare that they get through all bills. After that, the bills go to the full House for consideration. In recent years, the Senate hasn't considered any individual appropriations bills on the Senate floor, and again, generally acts on a House-passed package of all 12 appropriations bills or a compromise package that both chambers have negotiated between each other. So next, I'm going to focus on what happens on the House floor, usually between June and July. So the floor amendment process allows all House members to modify an appropriations bill. Members could introduce an amendment to increase funding for a program, decrease funding, or put conditions on the funding. So for example, a member could offer an amendment stipulating that no funding in the bill could be used to construct a border wall, for example. However, amendment opportunities depend on the rule structure, meaning the House approved resolution that sets parameters for debate on the House floor. Some rules may let any member introduce an amendment on the floor, while others may only allow a limited number of amendments or none at all. Additionally, amendments must adhere to certain rules about the kinds of items included in the appropriations bills. It's also important to highlight that during this process, members may seek to add or remove longstanding policy riders through a floor amendment. And policy riders are provisions that attach directives or conditions on funding, and they can modify existing laws or implement new initiatives. And this is a way to advance policy goals without having to pass standalone legislation. So, for example, a member may offer an amendment to repeal the prohibition that for decades has barred specific healthcare programs from covering abortion care, which is known as the Hyde Amendment. And then by August, the Senate and House usually have voted on some or rarely all appropriations bills. The House and the Senate will sometimes pass different versions of the same appropriations legislation. And in these cases, the two chambers will convene what's known as a conference committee composed of representatives and senators to reconcile differences between the two bills. This conferencing often happens behind the scenes, meaning that representatives and senators develop a compromise bill through private negotiations without formal committee hearings. And that compromise package has to pass both the House and the Senate before it become law. And so finally, this brings us to the final step, which is finalizing the appropriations bills. So the fiscal year ends on September 30th, and the new fiscal year begins on October 1st. So suppose Congress fails to pass one or more appropriations bills by the end of the fiscal year, which again is October 1st. In that case, Congress may pass what is known as a continuing resolution, or CR, to fund the government at the previous fiscal year's spending levels. And a CR doesn't need to last an entire fiscal year. Often Congress will pass a CR to buy more time to negotiate full year appropriations bills. But without a CR or an appropriation bill for the new fiscal year, government funding lapses, resulting in a government shutdown. Obviously not ideal. So in recent years, Congress has not met the October 1st deadline to enact appropriations bills into law, and instead pass a CR to allow more time for negotiations. These CRs have typically lasted through early to mid-December, at which point Congress passes an omnibus spending package containing all 12 appropriations bills for the upcoming fiscal year. For example, in 2022, Congress finalized the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023 on December 23rd. Being home in time for the holiday break is a great motivator for Congress to get its work done, which is why an omnibus bill usually gets passed in late December. I know that's a lot of information and that this can be an opaque and frustrating process at times. But I hope that you have a clearer picture of the key moments and inflection points. And if you'd like more information, the CPCC has just released an explainer containing these key dates and an explanation of these steps, which will be dropped in the chat now. Likewise, you can reach out to me with any questions or comments at ross@progressivecaucuscenter.org. And with that, I'll pass it back to Emma. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Ross. And you really did explain how complicated this process is, and also how Congress doesn't really actually stick to their deadline. So thank you for that. I'm sure we'll get to many of the questions that folks are asking in the chat a little bit later. As Jess just said, and I know there's been a few questions in the Q&A and in the chat, but all of these resources will be shared with you, all of you, after this event in a few days. But please make sure you're registered. We can't send it to you unless we have your email address. So just register at the link, even if you're already in this and you clicked on the live now one as well from our email. So now I'm going to turn to our incredible panelists for really a discussion, a robust discussion. And then at the end, like I said, we're going to get to many of your questions that you're asking, but keep asking them in the chat. And so really my first question for our panel is to everyone. And it's one that I think people are asking right now, but also, why we shouldn't be involved. And so to any panelists, I would like to answer this first one. In your opinion, what are the best ways to secure policy and programmatic wins for our communities using the appropriations process Ross just outlined? And I'd love if folks could share some strategies that they've seen work or used yourself to advocate for within the appropriations process that you've found success in. Open question.
I can offer just a quick anecdote. I handled for many years the Labor, Health, Human Services, and Education appropriations. And that is a bill that is now over $200 billion. I don't want to say the level because I don't remember right now, but it's really high up there. When I started working on it, I think it was like $119 billion. So we've gone up over 20 years. There's so many programs, but one of those cycles, I got spammed like aggressively on email, faxes, and phone calls about this small education technology program. I cannot begin to tell you. I had to look up like, what is this program? I think it was like $12 million. And the request was to double it. Well, I think it was doubled because the organizing around this small program was so effective. It was very annoying to the staffers working inside because it was overwhelming amount of paper and email, and they were not form emails. They were like real from people from like different states. And I couldn't say, I'm sorry, I only work for Connecticut. I work for Congressman DeLauro. No, because it was about the program and it was national of scope. So organizing and tailoring your message and going at it consistently really does work in this process.
Oh, Letty, that was fantastic. So I'm hearing organizing, I'm hearing aggressive follow-up and follow through and requests and staying on congressional staffers as much as possible. That's a fantastic example. Erica, I'd love to hear if you have one as well.
Yeah, I would say, you know, there's, I'm not going to take credit for this. I do want to share an incredible campaign that it's a big coalition organization called the Defund Hate Campaign. If you all haven't heard about it, I'm happy to share the link to the website. But on the side of on immigration, it's a very complicated issue, we all know. And unfortunately, we have been losing a lot in the past, few years. From the Trump administration, we went through a really hard time. And now under the Biden administration, it has, it's gotten a little bit better, but we're still struggling. But the Defund Hate campaign, was just like this huge coalition of organizations that were very, very focused on defunding CBP, which is the Border Patrol, and also defunding ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is basically they're both under DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and I mean that goes under the Homeland Security Subcommittee. And I mean, they were super focused on the subcommittee. Also, as Leticia was mentioning, lots of organizing, having people call the subcommittee members, making sure that they knew that there were consequences to continuing to fund ICE and CBP and continuing to grow their budget. Now, unfortunately, their budget has been continually growing over the years. Now we have the biggest budget for both agencies. And it just keeps going up. But the coalition and the campaign has actually blocked, I think it might be around 12 billion from ICE and CBP in one way or the other. So again, very focused, they know the subcommittee, they know where to go, and all of us have been part of the organizing and the calling and making sure that that they know the consequences of this.
That's fantastic. And, with Letty's example, we heard what we can do when we want something, and hearing your example, hearing what we need to do when we need to be on the defense, when we need to block something that we don't want, right? That we don't want for our communities and for ourselves in many instances. So thank you for sharing that, Erica, and also the persistence that's required. Now, I know a lot of folks in the chat and in the Q&A are wondering, what's different about this moment? We kind of heard from Ross. The process is complicated. We often miss these deadlines, but there's so much unknown in this Congress with a Republican-controlled House, and threats around, what the budget is going to look like for this upcoming fiscal year. So, what's different about the process this year than in years past, and how do we prepare to fight for the programs our communities depend on? Letty, I'd love to go with you first.
Sure. We want to take a look at, who and what. First, who? We have in the lead on the Senate side, Senator Patty Murray, a real veteran of more than 30 years. She just comes off the Health Committee, cares deeply about the Appropriations Committee that she served on for years. And Susan Collins, her good friend. They're very friendly. On the Republican side as a ranking member. On the House side, we have Congresswoman Granger from Texas, now the chair, my former boss, Ms. DeLauro, the ranking member. So it's 4 women. And in the OMB, we have Shalonda Young, our former staff director in the House. So these processes, they don't happen in a vacuum. It's about people, and it's people who drive it. So these folks are going to try to make it happen somehow, some way. But there's some elements that are explosive. And like you were saying, Emma, we really don't know exactly where it's going to go. The majority in the House has placed in the committee a couple of members from the Freedom Caucus, Andrew Clyde from Georgia and Michael Cloud from Texas. And there's Andy Harris, and there's other very conservative members. And in order to elect the speaker, in order for them to have their vote, there's some type of agreement that the appropriations bills would go to fiscal year 22, meaning, think of appropriations like a pizza pie, and then we break it up in different little pieces of the pie. So the whole pie has a big number that then gets divided to subcommittees that fund all the departments. And you start with a big number, which in the budget is the 302A, and they want to have a top line number that goes back to 2 years. And I read somewhere that Clyde wants to go back to fiscal year 19. This would be devastating. 22 would be devastating to communities, neighborhoods, because what is in these programs, in these bills, is services for families. It's housing, it's education, it's childcare, it's low income, it's energy, the works, environment programs, the Army Corps of Engineers, transportation. So this is all money that state and local officials have laid out and put out to the communities. If you go back to 22, you're looking at a cut of $130 billion to that big pie. So then the smaller pie, the bills, will also suffer big cuts. And Mr. Clyde wants to take it back to 19 because he says we need to go back to pre-pandemic times. So there's a narrative here that is about erasing all the spending that has helped families stay afloat in the past 3 years. Will the Senate, will Collins and Murray be able to, as Ross was saying, the Senate doesn't bring bills to the floor. Will they be able to bring those bills to the floor and have more weight and have more power to then negotiate in the fall? I think that's their plan. Will they be able to do it? And will Ms. Granger from Texas, as the new chair, be able to work a deal with Ms. DeLauro? Probably not. She probably has to tend to the leadership and to this secret deal of cutting. And the key thing is, will the House be able to get bills out of subcommittee and onto the committee and onto the floor? Now, if they do, you said the question is what's different beyond this dynamic, which is a lot like 2011. If you look at this process, we sort of went through something similar in 2011 that ended up in budget caps for 10 years. But if it is like that, they might not be able to get some of those bills out. But if they do, and they come to the floor, Republicans in the House want to do something different. They want to open up for devastating cuts, programs that are not authorized. Now, in these appropriations bills, there's many programs that have not been passed into law by the authorizing committees. In the Congress, you pass a bill, you pass a law, doesn't mean you fund it. The Appropriations Committee is the one that funds it. That authorization may run out. They want to give power to members to come to the floor and offer cuts on programs that are not authorized. Or if you have an amendment that says we want $500 million more for Title I for education, if the program has been authorized, because it was 2015 the last time it was authorized, so it's out of range, then they will hold a rule that says you cannot offer that amendment. They will not waive the rule to offer it because it's not authorized. Anyways, in very, very complicated ways, they're going to put things in place to make these cuts real. out of the House. And like Ross was saying, this has to be negotiated in the fall. And I think we know exactly, or we know where things are going to go all the way to maybe August. Hopefully the Senate will do their bipartisan process, hopefully, and the House will have these draconian cuts. And in the fall, within the context of the debt limit, you know, I don't know exactly what happens. I don't think a lot of us do know what happens. If the debt limit thing gets fixed somehow and both House and Senate come together, Democrats have given the votes to pass appropriations bills even when Republicans were in the majority. So that's possible. It's not impossible that we see that dynamic. And I know I've talked a lot about it. I just want to say, tune in. It's going to be explosive along the way. The markups on the House are going to be a lot of fun. My former boss, Mr. Laurel, has already asked every secretary of the department to center what these cuts mean in terms of pain and hurt in the programs and for families. We have a new senator at the top of labor HHS, Senator Baldwin. So it's going to be interesting. It's going to be very dynamic. But I want folks to take away the fact that these folks, they're all going to drive their agendas forward, and hopefully, you know, sanity will prevail. And there's a lot of experienced people here that want to get this done. So we'll see.
Thank you, Letty. And I think in that fantastic explanation, I also think we answered some folks' questions in the chat around, you know, is this going to look like under President Trump? But what we're talking about is more similarities between the Budget Control Act of 2011 and some of those devastating cuts that we saw to all of our, you know, human needs programs, everything from Head Start, you know, to education, to healthcare. So thank you.
Another thing that we want to keep tabs on and monitor closely is the conversation between Republican majority on the cuts to defense. Ms. Granger has said she will not cut the defense budget, but these Freedom Caucus members saying we want to cut defense. So if you don't do entitlement programs, if you don't cut defense, what's going to happen? It's all going to fall on the human services side.
Yep. And we're gonna get to the Pentagon stuff in a moment. I promise that. I know that's also one of the reasons people have joined. And so in the interest of time, I'm actually gonna move on to our next questions. I know we have so much audience engagement as well. And Sarah, I'd love to turn to you next. You know, as a fellow parent, a new parent, my son is 8 months old. I know how busy parenthood is, and you know, lots of people don't spend their free time advocating. I can't say that I've been able to craft a lot of time out of my schedule in the last 8 months to advocate for my own stuff. And so what makes you feel like you want to be involved and are involved in federal advocacy for programs like Head Start?
The way things are going, I have to for my kids. It's totally advocating for my kids, and I happened across meeting one of my legislative, she was up to be elected this last November. She didn't end up getting elected, but she is still a very big organizer here in Billings. And so I keep tabs with her, and she keeps all of us. She's actually extended out to all of Montana since November. And she keeps us up to date on everything and provides actions we can take and how to do them, which has been huge in cutting it down to the meat of how I can advocate. Because like you said, as a mom of two, it's rough to carve out that time, but And I'm assuming this is where I put in what I've wrote up for this and the
Yes, please.
of Head Start and then my story for it. Head Start is both my kids have gone, and it's an amazing program. It has served 40 million children and their families since 1965. The program had 840,000 enrolled across 17,485 centers nationwide in fiscal year 22. But even then, with those numbers, it fell short of being able to meet the needs of the families. Before the pandemic, only 36% of eligible 3 to 5-year-olds had access. Then the pandemic happened and it further restricted the access to the amazing programs that Head Start has. And so for my family and myself, Head Start has been a blessing. Both of my children have attended. My son, who just turned 7, went until he aged out. And my 2-year-old daughter is currently enrolled. She began when she was about 6 months old. When my son first started, I worked full-time as a pharmacy technician and was barely making ends meet. And my partner needed to get back to work to help tie loose ends, I guess. But even with them working, there was no way we could afford childcare. When I was researching options and programs, I came across the application for Head Start. I vaguely heard about it, but so I applied with it. I applied and didn't have much hope of acceptance. But to my surprise, I received a phone call the next day from a family advocate wanting to schedule a meeting. During my meeting, I was told there wasn't room for him yet because he was a couple months shy of 2 years old. But there was a spot when he turned 2, and it was only a month or so. My family advocate provided so many resources to help us bridge the gap for food and to help me pay rent and whatever other incidentals we needed. And when he finally got to start, he only spoke a handful of words, and he spoke through words and gestures. But now he excels academically. And for the past 2 years, he's been in the gifted and talented program at school. He just got 2nd place in the school spelling bee for his elementary school. My daughter, who just turned 2, speaks in 3 to 4 word sentences and is quite clear in being able to understand her. She can identify several colors, multiple animals, and is beginning with numbers and shapes. So as you can see, my family counts on Head Start, and it's 100% a necessity for us. All of our families and communities count on programs just like this and they fall in that non-defense category. And to keep us healthy, and along with our food, our air safety, keeping our air and our water clean. So they are imperative. And it's something our families need more than ever. And this funding it needs to stay, it needs to grow even, but how it is for me.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story, and you're getting a lot of love in the chat and a lot of support. And like you said, Head Start is for our children. Therefore, it's for our community, it's for our nation, and it does so many great things. And it's, as you said, it's 100% federally funded. And it's such a great example of what we can do when we have organizers and leaders like yourself being involved in the programs from the beginning of your childhood's life to the advocacy. So thank you for being here. And we love working with you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so as positive as Head Start is, right? Knowing that it needs to grow, knowing that it's still not meeting demand, early Head Start and regular Head Start for the older kids, as you said, Sarah. Those are the programs that we fight for, right? That we want to keep investing in. Now I'm going to turn a little bit to the programs that we don't want to invest in. And I think we touched upon this a little bit before, but that stuff like the Pentagon, maybe some stuff around DHS and other things, right, that are harmful to our communities. And so, Ashik, I'm going to turn to you. We've seen the Pentagon continue to increase year after year. And as we've talked about, it's really at the expense of some of our schools and so many needs at home. So can you tell us why there seems to be some big support for Pentagon increases in spending, and how we might shift some of that narrative back to support for things in our community really needs?
Yeah, thank you. So just to start by emphasizing how big the support is for Pentagon spending compared to everything else we just heard about, which are real human needs. This year's Pentagon budget is over $850 billion for 2023. So just to put that in historical context, that's more than almost any point in US history since World War II. It's higher proportionally than the Vietnam War, higher than the height of the Cold War in the 1980s. And those are times when people in the US perceived much more serious military threats in the world than we do today, and much less dire threats on other fronts. Like, we are several years now into a pandemic. We have the climate crisis intensifying. There are huge economic problems that we're contending with now. So the annual discretionary budget for the Pentagon and nuclear weapons adds up to half the entire discretionary budget, which is more than spending on public education, public health, housing, community investment, and all other social programs combined in the discretionary budget. So if you add Homeland Security, veterans programs, and federal law enforcement, which are forms of what we consider militarized non-military spending, that accounts for over 2/3 of the annual discretionary budget. So that leaves less than $1 in $3 for everything else that Congress appropriates every year. And a huge reason for that is the role of military contractors, which are private companies that get over half of that military budget. So half of the military budget that's appropriated every year goes to private companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and that funding for contractors over the past 20 years since 9/11 adds up to about $7 trillion, which is almost as much as the entire cost of those post 9/11 wars. So it's really in the interest of these private companies to be extremely effective lobbyists for more and more money from members of Congress. And that's the big reason why this just keeps going up year after year. They're just very good at lobbying, and they have lots of money to put into it. And this spreads a lot of that funding across many congressional districts. And it's a reality that it does create jobs in many parts of this country that are otherwise pretty underinvested in, that have pretty slim economic prospects because of many decades of underinvestment from the government. So that creates a lot of pressure on representatives across the political spectrum to keep supporting high military funding. And that's a pretty compelling and politically effective narrative to justify higher and higher spending. It's seen as a job creator. But there are a bunch of studies, including from some of our partners at the Cost of War Project at Brown University, that finds that for every $1 billion in military spending, that creates something like 11,000 jobs. But for every billion in spending for education, over twice as many jobs are created. And similarly, for every $1 billion in funding for green energy or healthcare, there are many more jobs created compared to military funding. So this is a big political challenge, because just the reality in many communities is that so many jobs are being created because of the military industrial complex. But in the short to medium to longer term, we need to constantly be thinking about what military industrial conversion could look like to shift jobs and resources to other alternatives, especially in a time of climate crisis, to creating green industrial alternatives for good jobs in every community. So some of that in a much smaller scale than needs to happen has started to happen through, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act. The Biden administration's Build Back Better program was supposed to create a big alternative to that. So some of that is starting to happen, but not nearly at the scale that it needs to. And everything we heard from Letty and Sarah especially just emphasizes how much more social spending should go into other things. And that's where at the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, we talk a lot about trade-offs with the military budget or militarized budget. So just basic things like quantifying for every amount of things in the militarized budget, what else could we get in that funding? So for example, for what we paid a single Pentagon contractor in the past year, nearly 1 million children could have been funded for high quality preschool. In green energy, in the 20 years since 9/11, the US has spent $21 trillion on war and militarism at home and abroad. And for less than a quarter of that cost, about $4 trillion, the US could have a fully renewable energy grid by now, which is something that a lot of people don't even think is technically possible, but that could have been done. And if we cut the Pentagon budget by $100 billion, which was suggested by the Congressional Budget Office recently, we could build enough solar power for every household in this country. So these are all things that are technically possible, and the government has the power to do these things. But it's really just a matter of enough people realizing that it's technically possible and organizing for it, and just really emphasizing the trade-offs of how much is going currently to doing harm that could be doing, well, a huge amount of good instead.
Thank you so much. And I think I can speak for a lot of people who know about the National Priorities Project that your trade-off document and your website is fantastic. And I'm hearing some very similar themes around organizing, both for the things we want and for the things that we don't want. And so Erica, I'm going to turn to you for our last question before we open it up for audience Q&A. And thank you to everyone for being so patient, because we would be here for 2 hours if we all had the time to sit here and learn from our incredible panelists. So my last question, Erica, I think you kind of talked about this a little bit when you answered the first panel question, but I'd love to hear more about what we should be on the watch for in this year's Homeland Security spending bill. And I know when you were talking about ICE and CBP, we'd love to hear more about how it's just impacted your life and your family's lives and the communities that you really care about. And for those who don't know, you kind of said it earlier about ICE and CBP, but maybe you could just give a brief overview on what the Homeland Security bill actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll try to keep it brief. So I'll just start with some numbers, and then I'm gonna go into my story so you can actually see the picture of this. But unfortunately, you see all the news about immigration, the border, a lot of people who really want to get rid of asylum and that just basically don't want immigrants. A lot of these groups are literally hate groups, anti-immigrant groups. They have been pushing a lot, and Fox News, a lot of other players have really pushed for this narrative that has allowed for about $25 billion over tax money to go to both CBP and ICE, Border Patrol, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That's $25 billion that could also be used for everything that our fellow panelists talked about earlier, right? I don't have to repeat it. And unfortunately, it's about 16, I think almost 17 billion that are actually going to Border Patrol. And again, because of the same narrative that keeps on coming up, that there's like all these, this crisis at the border and so on, that's we usually hear on the news. But unfortunately, all this money doesn't necessarily go to figure out how we can create a more humanitarian sort of welcoming border, but rather how we can create a more militarized and more unwelcoming border. Unfortunately, like more Border Patrol agents, more detention at the border and so on. And then about, I would say $1 billion go to ICE. So ICE for me has been one of the agencies that has been an absolute nightmare in my life. ICE was in about 10 years ago, they came to my home and knocked. They told me that they were looking for my mom, and they lied about why they were looking for her. I have regretted my entire, for this past 10 years, have regretted opening that door because I didn't know it was ICE. It was just people dressed, in jeans and a white shirt. And I opened it and, they called on my mom, they handcuffed her and they took her in front of me, in front of my 17-year-old brother. I still have a lot of trauma behind it. So if you hear my voice, it's because it was one of the most traumatic experiences of my life, seeing that a 60-year-old woman that, it's basically everything for me, was taken without having done anything other than have crossed the border with her children to run away from domestic violence. And so my story it's a reflection of millions of people who are right now being targeted by ICE, and people who have not only been raided, but also detained in this sort of immigration detention machine that has continued to grow. And right now, basically the funding that we're giving ICE allows for about 34,000 people to be detained in immigration detention. Majority of these folks, over 90% of people who are in immigration detention, haven't even had, they don't even have a misdemeanor or a felony. I mean, there are people waiting, they're in proceedings to be deported or to ask for asylum. And so what we're doing is basically giving more and more money for these detention centers to grow, for more immigration agents to be hired, for more of them to go to houses like mine and take people like my mother. And so, now that we're here, that we have this audience, it's just the biggest message for me is to ensure that if we want, all those amazing opportunities for our children, we want, to continue to fund education, healthcare, everything that we need to make sure that we defund all of these anti-immigrant hateful policies, and basically all these agencies will continue to grow. And honestly, I think they will continue to grow if we don't say stop and it's enough, because that's a narrative. That's a narrative that the other side is continuing to create for us. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you, Erica, for you're getting a lot of love and support in the chat, and also reaffirming that should have never happened to you. You're gonna make me cry for just how difficult that must have been for you. And we are here and sending you healing energy as that has to happen throughout your life. I know we are almost at time, so we are going to actually ask some audience questions, but we are going to encourage folks to stay on for a few more minutes so we can get to more of your questions, as many as we can. Like I said, we wish this could be 2 hours. So the first question I'm going to ask for kind of the whole panel, and it's, we've heard a lot about what we want, what we don't want, how we can organize. And I saw some things in the chat and the Q&A about, but what are congressional forms? How do I fill those out? What do those look like? How do I get how do I get a meeting with my member, et cetera. So Ross, I'll turn to you first to kind of answer that question. In the same vein, could you just briefly say, I know we put in the chat, but I want to make sure folks hear it, what earmarks are that are now known as congressionally directed spending?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, community project funding, congressionally directed spending, also called earmarks. They're really for member requested specific project, generally in a member's district. So it's like, while appropriations fund programs and agencies, generally earmarks are more of a specific, usually physical project in a member's district, like a firehouse, for example. So yeah, there's a lot of deadlines that happen with the appropriations process, as I went over. Usually for a earmark request, members will put a form up on their website That'll include instructions for it, what they're looking for. I'll drop one from last Congress. This is Rep. Debbie Dingell's form. And so the Appropriations Committee will set the deadline for getting requests into them. Usually, and correct me if I'm wrong, Letty, it's like late April generally. But then they'll set their members will set their own deadlines to get their submissions in so they can consider them and then submit those to the Appropriations Committee. So there's a good example in there. You really kind of have to keep an eye out on the Appropriations Committee website and members' websites for when they put that out, since they all kind of determine themselves how it goes. But yeah, Letty, if you have anything to add there, definitely.
Yeah, I was on Chief of Staff for Ms. DeLauro when she was successful in bringing them back in early 21. And there was a lot made about abuse and in congressional directed spending 10, 15 years ago. And they're now capped at how many a member can get. And I'll just say it is a fantastic way to bring some seed money. It's not every year, it's a one-year money to a need in the community. So this year, they're community projects. And if you want 500,000, $1 million, $1.5 million for 1 year, you can get a whole lot of support from your mayor, from your county executive, from community leaders, send it to the office of the Congress person or senator, and you know, you could be successful. So and
Could you give a quick example, Letty, of what that might look like?
one example, I remember meeting with someone from New Haven that worked at a mental health clinic and was helping children with autism. Her wait list was 7 years for a diagnosis of autism. There was not a lot of support in terms of funding from the state. You know, she relied on foundations. So I was super excited to be able to say to my boss, this is a desperate need. And if we direct $1 million to this organization, this entity that's a nonprofit, they're going to be able to really, you know, help their wait list, maybe cut it in half, even with $1 million. So, so that's one example. There's like things that you just can't get funding for anything else, like, you know, renovation of an ER for a hospital, Boys and Girls Club sometimes get funding through this form. If you look at the earmarks this past year, a lot of it has been for cities and towns, backed up projects that the money was not there and the member could actually put the money there. And this is an interesting way to keep the process running too, because appropriations is a process that is really only visible sometimes to the Appropriations Committee members. So the rest of the Congress, the rest of the members follow programs and they care about it. But if they have a community project for themselves in their district, they're going to be more invested and they might just kind of vote for it. Or maybe not these days, but it's just a way to keep the process running.
Thank you. That was very helpful. And you probably saw that since we're at time, we're over time now, but there's a poll, a final poll, we call it a post-assessment. 2 questions, what you learned about and how you think you might engage now that you've been in this briefing training. So please fill it out when you can, so we can learn from all of you and learn what you want to learn moving forward. There were several questions. Again, I'm just going to take 2 more. Several questions in the chat around climate priorities. How did those show up in the appropriations process? Asik, I think this might be the best question for you.
Sure, that's a really good question. Over the past few years, National Priorities Project has tried to quantify this in different ways. Like there are different funds and line items in the budget. Like every year, there's a massive spreadsheet put out from the president's office that we try to break down. And for climate, it's not as clear cut as the Pentagon budget, for example, whereas like the Department of Defense and then nuclear weapons in the Department of Energy are like distinct categories that have like a lot of sub things that add up to, you know, over $800 billion this year. So for climate and renewable energy, it's less clear cut. There are a lot of different pockets of spending. Like there's a particular renewable energy fund, I think in the Department of Energy that in previous years was something like $2 billion. So when the president's budget comes out in the next month, we'll break it down. But it's there's not one big pot of money that we can clearly say this is for climate funding. There are different things in the Department of Energy, and then some other departments that I'm not remembering offhand. Like there's the transportation budget, for example, which we can say is climate related. So yeah, it's not as straightforward to quantify it as it is for the Pentagon, where it's over half of the entire discretionary budget. But I can say confidently that it's much smaller. So in previous years, I think we did trade-offs like I'm not remembering a number offhand, but it's many dozens of times more than whatever category of renewable energy funding. That's what the military budget is. So yeah, the EPA, people are pointing out in the chat, Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, those are all climate related parts of the budget. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of a marker of how the federal government currently is prioritizing climate versus the military, which is not very much. Like if we had our way, there would just be a massive climate or green economy transition budget or something. But that's not happening yet.
Thank you. That was really helpful. If you haven't, I'm gonna do one very short question, which I think Ross or anyone actually will be able to easily answer, which is we had a few questions around how do members get feedback from their constituents, which is, it could be through the submission process, but also, how is it better to meet with staff? Ross, could you just briefly share, the meeting process and what folks should look out for, or who they should request meetings with?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I've spent 7 years on the Hill, so I've been through many appropriations cycle, and I've been sitting down with constituents, so I know a little bit about what makes a good request. But yeah, I think making the request specific. If you know of a letter that's already going around that you can point them to sign on to that aligns with your priorities, I think that's super helpful. About requesting a meeting, I would say request a meeting with staffer who handles the issue area that you're interested in. So for example, like if you want to talk about National Institutes of Health, you'd ask for a healthcare staffer generally, and they'll direct you about their process. But yeah, in-person meetings, virtual meetings, getting FaceTime with staff is super helpful. I always recommend to bring sort of district level data to show the real impact that the program has on members and their jurisdictions. People really look for that. It's really helpful for making the case for the funding. But yeah, I highly recommend doing a meeting. Hill staffers are usually pretty nice, so they won't bite. So yeah, recommend it.
The key is they won't bite. Thank you, Ross. And with that, I am going to close. And before I give my closing spiel, Heejin, could we close the poll to see? Thank you so much. Our post-assessment looks great. 68% of you learned more about the approach process. And it's great things. You learned a lot of things. And it sounds like 70% of you, I'm going to go with all the positive things, are excited to dive in and engaging on this process. Thank you for filling out those polls for us. In the interest of time, I won't read them all out like I did in the opening. And so I can't say enough gratitude to our fantastic panelists for joining us today, and for also sharing your stories and being vulnerable with us. We appreciate it so much. And since the center is so fantastic, our team has already started another briefing that we're planning, which is on March 9th, 3 weeks away from today. We'll be diving into the power and limits of executive action. And so if you want to come to that, learn about what executive actions are, what President Biden has done over the last 2 years, and what else is needed. Heejin is going to drop the link in the chat for that. It doesn't have that many details yet, but it does have the date and the RSVP. And as I said in the beginning, if you clicked on starting now from one of the center's emails, and you are a participant because you didn't register, please register so we can send you all of the wealth of information that our team has put together and the panelists have put together for this event. And we'll be sure to sign up for our stuff in the future. So you just get more of our briefings and trainings and events. And again, I wish this was longer, but I hope everybody learned something. I hope folks have a fantastic day. Thank you all for joining us and just being with us in this educational briefing. So I hope everybody has a great day.